Hello, I'm Jeff Thompson, President and CEO of the Institute of Management Accountants, and welcome to Unit 2 of our course, Improving Confidence in Sustainability Data. In this unit, we're going to focus more on the COSO internal control framework. Then, we're going to talk more about sustainability information and how the COSO internal control framework can specifically help assure and provide confidence over this very, very important set of performance data. So, in this unit, as an overview, we're going to identify the 5 core components of the COSO internal control integrated framework. And we're going to see why that word integrated is so important. We're going to recognize that the internal control system defined by COSO for all types of information, financial and non-financial, is most effective when the principles underlying COSO are present, functioning, and integrated. And that will become clearer when we define the principles underlying the components. And then also we're going to begin to blend this with sustainability or non-financial information by defining what we call the sustainability ecosystem. So, the COSO cube. The COSO cube has stood the test of time from when the COSO internal control framework was first introduced in 1992 and then updated in 2013. As I said earlier, COSO stands for the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. This is the internal control integrated framework. And the cube, of course, for those of you who know and love math and geometry, I'm sure you all do, know that a cube has 3 dimensions. One dimension of the cube is the dimension that's called the entity dimension. So when you think about the importance and application of internal controls to help assure organizations grow with confidence and integrity, entity level is very important. Meaning, is it the corporate level of internal controls? Is it subsidiary, business unit, plant, etc., etc.? The next part of the 3-dimensional cube is the type of objectives that the internal controls is trying to deal with. Objectives are not just reporting objectives, but they're operations objectives and compliance objectives. This again reinforces the point from Unit 1 that COSO is a framework for all types of information to give stakeholders, investors, corporations greater confidence in not just financial data, but non-financial or sustainability information. And then finally, the components. And we're going to be exploring these 5 components in further units. But the 5 components, I'm actually going to start at the top and very high level describe these components and then subsequently talk in greater detail. The control environment. The control environment is tone at the top. Do we have the right perspective on the importance of internal controls to not only support business, but to enable and grow businesses? So that will include the role of the board of directors, senior management, etc. Before we get into internal controls, which are designed to mitigate or manage a risk, we first need to talk about the risks to the business in achieving its objectives, whether they're current or emerging risks, whether they're financial or non-financial risk, competitive risk, technology risk, automation risk, etc., etc. Then we next define control activities. Control activities are those specific actions to manage or mitigate risk to an acceptable level of performance. And then we get into information and communication, where we describe our internal controls design and frameworks to all stakeholders within and often outside the organization. Remember, the supply chain of organizations today very much involves outsourced, offshored vendors who are part of the supply chain of the organization. So information and communication on internal controls effectiveness is very important. And last but not least is the monitoring component of COSO. Monitoring is where we try to reflect change and evaluate change. If change occurs in our environment, and of course it will, and it has, how does that impact our system of internal controls? How does that impact our risks, etc.? So those are the 5 components of the COSO integrated control framework. And here you see a more expanded version of the cube. As I said, the cube components are listed in order, and we're going to be expanding on these components in much, much greater detail. You know, there's not necessarily a sequential or a systematic list of these components. We have them there, but there is an element of relationship here. We always start with the control environment because that is so foundational to the other 4 components, and then the other components flow in turn. So we have the 17 principles. I've talked about the 5 components. Now think about an organization that's trying to comply in the US with Sarbanes-Oxley Section 404, which is the section that requires an attestation on the effectiveness of internal controls over financial reporting, or a similar requirement in China or Japan. How do organizations implement a system of internal controls? We don't want to give them too much prescription and box them in too much, but we want to give them some directional principles-based guidance. So we've already talked about the 5 fundamental foundational components of the COSO cube, but in 2013, COSO added 17 principles to help implement the elements of internal control. And you see 5 principles for the first component, control environment. We'll be talking about those in subsequent units, and likewise as we go down the line. As I said earlier, in order to have an effective system of internal controls over either financial or sustainability type information, the 17 principles have to be present, they have to be functioning, and they have to be integrated. They work together, and we'll be describing examples as we move forward. So, the sustainability ecosystem. Let's talk a little bit about what that means. When you think about the sustainability ecosystem, it's really not a whole lot different from the financial ecosystem. There are investors who have expectations. They want to understand how an organization is creating its strategy. How is the organization implementing its strategy? And most important, what type of information is the company communicating to affect its strategy and give the investor confidence that the organization understands how to create, generate, and sustain value. But investors have that expectations increasingly of non-financial type information, the societal purpose, how organizations are innovating, how they're treating their people, how they're treating the environment. Corporations are part of the ecosystem, of course, also known as preparers, right? They're the value generators that we're evaluating and we want to let grow and flourish. Supply chain partners. You know, there's so much vertical and horizontal integration in business today, which is good usually for consumers, but it also raises the bar on effective internal controls that reach into other organizations. And of course, there are customers and employees, customers who buy products and services, who want a top-notch product or service at a reasonable price. And then staff is actually part of the sustainability information. Staff retention, staff recruitment, nurturing millennials to help grow and give organizations a sense of purpose. So this is the sustainability ecosystem, but I would argue that this is also essentially the financial ecosystem. The COSO internal control framework, just to kind of summarize opportunities and challenges as it relates to assuring or providing greater confidence over sustainability type information. First of all, as we've said before, COSO is always intended to provide internal controls for both internal reporting, internal analysis, create strong organizations, as well as for external reporting disclosure purposes. From 1992 through today, that has always been the purpose. The COSO framework has always been meant to be a principles-based framework. It's not GAAP or it's not IFRS, which is very much more prescriptive because it's financial type information sourced from ERPs and general ledgers. Now, there are investors' concerns about this type of information, sustainability type information, for the reasons that we outlined in Unit 1. Sustainability information is often more qualitative. It's often more forward-looking. it often has more of a longer term dimension to it. So as such, it requires more professional judgment in reporting on that kind of information to internal and external stakeholders. So it's not that there's a lack of trust, but we need to do a better job at assuring that kind of information so that stakeholders, investors, internal management feels confident in using that data to make decisions. So that concludes Unit 2, which was a focus on the COSO Integrated Internal Controls Framework. We're next going to move on to Unit 3 and focus on the top upper component of the COSO framework, and that's the control environment. Thank you.